Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. I'm just going to right at the start, give a quick little plug for the Noosa update. We are in the process of securing some great national and international speakers, and all will be revealed in the new year, but put this in your calendar. It's going to be another great meeting. I wanted to thank our sponsors tonight, Olympus and Fresenius Kabi. Obviously, without their support, these dinners would not happen. We've got Grant and Adam from Fresenius here tonight. They've got a new app for bowel prep, which seems to be really helpful for patients. So have a chat to them tonight. And then Olympus, Sean and Ash are here as well. So thank you very much, guys, for your support. Tonight, I thought it would be a good time for us to have a chat about the new item numbers for colonoscopy and the surveillance guidelines, both of which have been introduced this year. We've got two speakers tonight. Unfortunately, Cameron Bell's flight up from Sydney was cancelled with storms, and despite Jane frantically working to get him on another flight, that was also canned. So we're going to try and audio Cameron in later on tonight, and we'll do our best with that. So apologies everyone for that. But we've also got Professor Ben Devereaux speaking tonight. Ben's been very active in his role with GESR and his liaisons with the Department of Health, and his insights will be fantastic tonight to hear particularly about the item numbers. So without further ado, I'll invite Ben to the microphone.
Thanks very much, Sam. There's not many talks you have to give where you state the date of the topic on the in the title, but that's the way colonoscopy is in Australia at the moment. So I thought I'd actually put in that we're going to look at colonoscopy in Australia in respect particularly of item numbers as of now, November 19. So in the overview of the talk, there's clearly been a lot of action in the space of colonoscopy over the last few years, particularly in the last few months. I'm just going to touch on the MBS, particularly for the younger members of the audience, and what the MBS is. What is the cost of colonoscopy services to the MBS and to the country? I'm going to touch on the new colonoscopy item numbers. I'm not going to go through them. We discussed these at a previous presentation, and of course you're all across it because it is the reality of now, and you're all utilising them. But many questions still arise, and we're all asked questions about what's appropriate to use in what setting, and there'll be plenty of time in discussion to perhaps network some of those solutions. What are some of the issues that have arisen? And again, I think much of this will come out in discussion. How are these being addressed, and what role has GESQ played since the introduction or with the impending introduction to help smooth the way, and what does the future hold? I'm going to specifically comment on the multiple operation rule and the difficulty that has arisen as a result of the additional polypectomy item number and what we should do going forward. I'm just trying to get my slides to go forward on my computer. This isn't progressing. I'll try it again. So that's not... Okay, good. Okay, So it's been a busy space in colonoscopy, and of course for many years we've understood the role of the Conjoint Committee in recertification, and you might even ask why I've put that there. So not all colonoscopists in Australia are certified. Of course, we have the National Bowel Cancer Screening Program that we've participated in for many years now, for a decade or so. This year, the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare released the colonoscopy clinical care standard, and that's now mandated as of January of this year that we comply with the requirements of the standard. And that's of particular importance for accreditation of us as colonoscopists and for accreditation of hospitals around the country, that they can document that they're adhering to those standards. Of course, there's recertification as well, and that was a GESQ initiative, and that has been well adopted throughout the country, and that too was mandated in February of this year, that colonoscopists recertify every 3 years, and that's part of the clinical care standard and is part of our credentialing. Then we have the clinical practice guidelines on surveillance of colonic polyps, which pretty well has hit us at the same time as many of the as the item number changes, and Cameron and others will discuss that. And then of course we have the medical benefit schedule changes and the colonoscopy item changes. So all of this has happened in colonoscopy over the last few years, particularly the last 4 or 5 of them, where there really hadn't been any action in this space for many years. Before I move on, I just want to touch base about the clinical care standard. I've not been involved in this, nor do I represent the Commission, but I just thought it's valuable because it does tie in with a number of the issues that I've raised. I'm sure you've all seen it, and it's important that you have, as adherence to it has been mandated, as I said, and there are 9 specific standards that need to be addressed. The Commission is good in that it produces consumer, clinician and health services fact sheets. Compliance was mandated this year. I just want to touch on issues related to clinicians and issues related to reporting and follow-up. If we look at the clinician requirements, from January 1 of this year, certification was required to meet the clinical care standard. And this certainly has driven increased demand for recognition from the Conjoint Committee. They're actually seeing an upswing in applications. So that's really telling, I think, for a lot of us who thought, well, we're all conjoint certified. But importantly, as I've mentioned, recertification has also been mandated. And we currently have over 1,200 participants in that program, but it's still only estimated to be over 50% of colonoscopists. There are many colonoscopists out there who have not recertified or have engaged in the program, and it's very important that they do so, because for their institution, for their unit to be accredited, there has to be a clear path that process is being pursued. The other point regarding the Commission and the standard that I wanted to mention, more for information's sake, is the reporting and follow-up requirements, because this comes into issues related to the item numbers as well. Patients must leave the endoscopy unit after a procedure, after a colonoscopy, having been informed of the outcome of the procedure, any adverse events, and if any specimens were taken, biopsies or particularly polypectomy. And I think it's particularly valuable that they leave with printed information. We've all been in the situation where we've spoken to someone 2 hours after procedure, only for them not to recall. So some form of written documentation in addition to that provided by the unit as to what to do in the event of an adverse event, who to call, etc. So there's that requirement, but most importantly, patients must receive formal written follow-up with biopsy, polyp histology, and I think number, and a treatment follow-up plan. So that's changed our practice, and I expect it's changed many of your practices. Patients must receive the report, but the histology. And that's very important, as we've all come to understand, in how we can administer and implement the new colonoscopy item numbers. So I make those points about the Commission standard for general information, but how it ties in with the item numbers. I know nearly all of you, many of you know this, but I just want 2 slides on Medicare. So it's the universal health system introduced in 1984. To provide Australian residents with affordable, accessible and high quality healthcare. high-quality healthcare, and high-quality colonoscopy, and the aim for high-quality colonoscopy was indeed a tenet of the Gastroenterology Clinical Committee that looked at the item numbers. Now, Medicare comprises the MBS, the Medicare Benefit Schedule, the PBS, and the National Health Care Agreement, that is the contractual agreement between the federal government and the states. All Australians are entitled to the benefits for health professional services listed on the MBS, subsidised drugs through the PBS, and free public hospital services. And Medicare is administered by the Department of Human Services, not the Department of Health. It provides rebates for over 5,700 items. Each item contains a fee and a benefit. Importantly, it covers clinically relevant services provided by medical practitioners and other healthcare providers. And as you're aware, rebates are 100% for out of hospital, etc., 75% of the fee for private patients in private or public hospitals. Importantly, providers are free to set their own fees. Patients pay the balance of the fee gap above the rebate, and private health insurance must cover at least 25% of the gap between the MBS rebate and the fee for in-hospital services. And some of the messages there tie in with the new colonoscopy item numbers as well. To put it in context, Medicare rebates were provided for 400 million services in 16-17, up from 373 million in 14-15. And Medicare expenditure for 16-17 was $22.3 billion. So Medicare is an expensive operation, and the federal government has a lot of skin in the game. When we come to gastroenterology and we look at the distribution of benefits paid in 16 and 17 for gastroenterology and hepatology by service, you can see in green that most of the benefits were paid for therapeutic procedures and 36% for professional attendances. So our procedural billing is a huge piece of the gastroenterology Medicare pie. When looking at colonoscopy in Australia, there are greater than 900,000 colonoscopies performed annually in the context of our population of 24.5 million people. And importantly, 75 to 80% of these are performed in private day hospitals. So private billing of colonoscopy is a big ticket item. How much is spent on funding colonoscopy services in Australia? Again, 16-17 data, $117 million for the old 32090 and 93, a lot of money. So when it comes to the MBS and you, me, are responsible for the service claimed. You, me, must have provided the service. Each claim must be clinically relevant, not just performed for no good reason, nor a part of a research project in its own right. And your claim must match the item number descriptor, and that's very important. Outliers may undergo an audit. What's become clear in the process over the last 18 months is that the federal government, the Department of Human Services, really doesn't like doing audits. Audits are difficult, they're time-consuming, they're expensive. And when we tried to use, and I certainly tried to use audits as a tool to manipulate the approach to item number changes, they never wanted to pursue it. And yet instinctively we say, we're all trying to do the right thing. If someone's doing the wrong thing, just audit them. That just didn't work. You must keep up to changes with the schedule and related guidelines. And that brings us then to the new colonoscopy item numbers, and this was from the quick reference guide that's online from the Department of Health. I'm not going to go through them, you've seen them all, but there they are listed, the 2222 through to 9, etc. And we can discuss any questions or nuances amongst the group later. But what I was asked to do was to comment on GES's activity. And I'm not going to comment on all the activity that was undertaken before the introduction. Certainly, when I was on the second iteration of the clinical committee that looked at this, I was not a GES representative. It was an unusual situation. I was there as an individual and we didn't represent the society. But nonetheless, it was wearing two hats. And we worked very hard to try and influence appropriately the outcomes. Nonetheless, after deathly quiet for most of 2019, and several letters to the Minister and the department asking where we were at, we too were surprised when it was announced 6 to 8 weeks before the introduction that the changes were happening. And of course, as many of us were, we weren't pleased about that. And then we had the official announcement and presentation at AGW this year that went through the issues. Following that, however, we communicated with the Minister and we were able to have a meeting with the senior representatives of the implementation task force or implementation team of the Department of Health who were looking at the implementation of these guidelines, of these new item numbers. And I went to that meeting in Canberra, and what came out of it? Well, we felt that we encouraged them to provide, albeit in a short time frame, increased information to colonoscopists, the frequently asked question communication. We did obtain a commitment to an early review at 6 months following their implementation, so that's coming up in the first quarter of next year. We were able to achieve the creation of this specific email address, which I know several of you have used, and it's essential, and I'll come to this, so that you could communicate questions, concerns or anomalies directly with the department. But despite this in our efforts, it was clear there was to be no deferral of the implementation. That die had been cast. But we were encouraged to directly communicate with the Minister, which was interesting because this was coming from his department. We wrote to the Minister, we expressed our concerns just as we had in Canberra, and we received a response from Minister Hunt. I don't think it's necessarily appropriate to release or show tonight the entire letter, but I've taken out some excerpts and I'll read this part to you because it's instructive. The Minister, I can confirm that colonoscopy changes will be implemented prospectively from 1 November. This means that any applicable time restrictions of the new items will be calculated from the last time a colonoscopy item was billed after 1 November 19. The time intervals will not be calculated from a service billed against any of the deleted items. This reduces the risk of patients unknowingly or inadvertently undergoing a colonoscopy outside the prescribed intervals. So that answers the question that has been circulating. This is prospective in respect of the item numbers, the new item numbers. There are still questions and challenges, but I think that makes it clear, and that's from the Minister's letter. So what resources have been made available for providers in tackling some of the challenges of patient eligibility? The Department of Human Services Medicare Provider Inquiry Line, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Health Professionals Online System is not available, but we have been assured this will be available from early 2020. And these provide advice as to if a service is payable or not. It doesn't give you any other advice, it really just looks and says that Mrs. X or Mr. Y had that item number 2.5 years ago, you can't bill it. It doesn't answer a clinical dilemma. Patients can seek clarification from the Department of Human Services Medicare General Inquiries line, again 24/7. They can assess their claiming history on My Health Record, or they can use the Medicare online account through MyGov or the Express Plus Medicare mobile app. So the government feels these are positives, and I think probably the value we're going to achieve is limited, but they see this as advantageous. But in implementing the new item numbers, it's important, and when asked questions, I think a reasonable response is that we all must make a reasonable effort to fulfil the criteria of the item number descriptor. So just as the Minister said that the implementation, and this is what I've struggled with, the implementation is prospective, but when you bill on your provider number an item, that's a contract with the payer. So you still have to make reasonable efforts when you bill a 32223 that they do have a first degree relative less than 55, or they did have an adenoma and their colonoscopy was greater than 5 years ago. Now, I think, however, that it's reasonable if a patient was advised by you 3 years ago to undergo a colonoscopy at the 3-year mark because they had 4 tubular adenomas, and they are dutifully doing as you advised them to do, and they're on your list tomorrow or my list tomorrow, then I think you're in a reasonable position to do the procedure and bill them. That's not written, but I think we have to be reasonable. And what I can convey is that the federal government does understand that the implementation of this is complex, and there is no appetite. They simply won't be able to do any auditing in the first certainly 6 months, and probably a lot longer than that. So this is an opinion of mine. There is no official statement on this from anyone, from GESQ, from the government or anyone. But I think, again, if you can convey that you've made reasonable efforts to fulfil that item descriptor, that is reasonable. However, going forward, I think we all must strictly adhere to item number descriptors. And as has been raised, it's important to understand that when you bill a colonoscopy now, that colonoscopy is billed using the item number that describes why you're doing it now. And the item number for the subsequent one depends on what you found now, what the procedure was like now, or indeed their family history. So we've gone to saying, I've billed this one as a 32222, and I say you need to come back in 5 years' time, and we put on our report now proposed item number 32223, so that administratively and from a referrer's point of view, hopefully that's clearer going forward. I think that's a reasonable approach. What is absolutely crucial is that everyone feeds back directly to the department with any questions or queries or anomalies. We all know them, we've all heard about them. What about 4 SSAs less than 10 millimetres? That conflicts. What do we do in that situation? You have to feed it back, because if we go to this 6-monthly review, if indeed it eventuates, and we'll push hard that it does, it's very important that there are hopefully hundreds and hundreds of queries. If we go back and they say, well, we've had 34 emails and 32 of them were from the same person in Sydney, that's going to make discussions very difficult. And here's an example from one of our colleagues in the room. And this is a really good example of how to communicate that I think will be constructive. And it simply says, look, there are discrepancies between the MBS item and the new guidelines. So this is very relevant for tonight, and no doubt many will be raised. The MBS recommends 5 years. The guidelines recommend 3 years when there are 3 to 4 sessile serrated adenomas less than 10 millimetres. And there's another example there. And this is Nick's email. But I put it up with his permission because this is really helpful stuff. And the more anomalies, particularly the clinical anomalies, the guideline anomalies that you can present and copy them to GESQ as well, is very helpful. So that's very important in how we manage issues. We come back to Minister Hunt's letter, and he says that I understand that the separate colonoscopy and polypectomy items under the new structure has created an unintended consequence due to the multiple operation rule, and that this may impact some of your members. My department is going to monitor the 1 November changes as they come into place and what impact that has on item number claiming patterns. I trust that your members will continue to adhere to best practice to ensure my department gets a clear picture of any behaviour change that occurs as a result of the introduction of these new items. This is an important paragraph. And obviously what's written between the lines isn't missed by you. There is no doubt that the implications of the multiple operation rule were unintended. The Gastroenterology Clinical Committee focused on colonoscopy. I was on that second iteration, and we were very focused on that. We had been reassured on multiple occasions that it was not the intention of the government that there would be any reduction in remuneration as a result of these changes, and this indeed was unintended. I don't think there's much doubt, however, that the department's kind of enjoying this a little bit. The colonoscopy aspect of the broader MBS task force review was protracted and difficult. So I think you can see that this issue of monitoring, they're basically sitting on their hands. We had a teleconference with the implementation people that we met in Canberra. We subsequently had a teleconference regarding this issue, and it was we had a pointed discussion about this. I also expressed at that time that there's really nothing for them to monitor. The issue is that the rebate's been dropped and you said you wouldn't do it. But nonetheless, there are a few things that I want to draw on from this paragraph. For those that aren't aware, and you'll be amazed at how many people throughout the country aren't aware, the multiple operation rule has been in the schedule since, as I understand it, since it began. The fees for 2 or more operations listed in Group T8, all of our procedures, performed on a patient on the one occasion are calculated by the following rule. 100% for the item with the greatest schedule fee, then 50% for the second one, then 25%, then 25%, then 25%, then 25%. So of course, when you've got 3,222, but you took a polyp off the 2,229, and you did an endoscopy on the same time, all of a sudden the endoscopy drops to 25%, and we've all been confronted with that. So this is a problem, and what are we doing about it? I simply would ask everyone to ponder your response and proceed with a little caution. Bringing patients back on a second occasion for a gastroscopy, that is saying, you know what, if you're only going to pay me a quarter, then I'm not doing them on the same day. I think it would be wise to just reflect on that, because there are implications. There's another day off work for the patient, there's impact on the carer, the babysitter, there's impact on the economy. There's possibly a second private health insurance excess for some patients, with some plans, mostly not. And importantly, the patient will have to undergo a second deep sedation. And I think that if you bring a patient back at 1 week, 1 day, 1 month, for the sake of not doing doubles on the day because of this drop, then there are professional issues, there are ethical issues, and I think there are real exposure issues to that. And if a patient had an adverse event in that second deep sedation, I think it would be a great challenge. The minister and the department monitor this. I think as a profession we expose ourselves if all of a sudden no doubles are done. 2 questions arise. Well, then why were you doing all the doubles beforehand? And secondly, if you really had to do all the doubles, are you telling the people of Australia that for the sake of $45 or $50 less per double, you've brought them back on another day? And I think that's important to ponder. No one has a problem with co-payments. The federal government has no problem with co-payments. In fact, the federal government has no problem if you do a colonoscopy for a clinical reason, preferably, on anyone, as long as they pay for it. They're only concerned with what they rebate. So if you want to charge a co-pay of $100 or $50 or $70, whatever, knock yourself out as far as they're concerned. But I think we need to be cautious as far as changing practice, because as was said in that minister's letter, we're just going to have a look and monitor changes in practice. So GES's proposed solution is a new item number. And that's a typo, it's a 30474, right? 30474. And it would be that you do an endoscopy when you claim the 3,229. So you can use 3 to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, right? You do a polypectomy, that's when the multiple operation rule kicks in, and we're saying just create another one so that if you're doing a double, you claim the endoscopy as a 30474. And of course, the rebate for that's doubled, so when it's quartered, it's the same as what was before. And this results in no net loss to the provider nor the government, and if in good faith they appreciate that we're acting in good faith and we're simply pursuing what they said and that there would be no drop in rebate, we hope that we receive a positive response to this. Whether that's the case or not, it's hard to know. So to summarise, clearly there have been multiple changes impacting colonoscopy practice in Australia, particularly over the last 12 months. I think it's important to ensure compliance with the colonoscopy clinical care standard, because that really goes to your accreditation and your unit's accreditation. The federal government, or indeed the taxpayer, is the payer for these procedures, and they have a legitimate right, whether we like it or not, to optimise their expenditure. And there is a real thrust to high quality colonoscopy, high quality care, and that's really within the brief of all of us anyway. Each provider is obliged to adhere to the MBS requirements. The new item numbers present challenges. I think most of us have worked our way through many of them, but the feedback to GESA and the feedback to the Department of Health through that email address is absolutely crucial. So if you've got 6 things in your mind and you haven't done it, please send that off. Consider your response to the multiple operation rule implications. We're working on a response, and obviously monitor yourself for changes and amendments over time, and we'll communicate that with you. And I'd encourage you all, for those who aren't, to become a member of GESA to assist us in this advocacy. We are the peak body nationally. If you're a member of the Queensland Society, it's completely different, and I think different groups, different missions, and you should all continue to support the Queensland Society. But I think it's important that as a group we represent the best for our patients and care and the health dollar and our members through membership of GESA. Thank you.
Is that working? Thanks, Ben. Really appreciate that talk. There's probably a lot of very strong opinions about a lot of the things that you've discussed tonight. We might leave some of that for the end after Cameron's talk, but does anyone have any specific questions for Ben that he might be able to address this evening? No? Okay. I'm sure there might be some questions after Cameron's talk and maybe some opinions as well. But thank you very much, Ben, for your talk tonight.
Dai farfalloni amoroso, notte e giorno d'intorno girano, delle belle turbando al riposo, Narcisetto a dolcino d'amor. Delle belle turbando al riposo, Narcisetto a dolcino d'amor. Non più avrai questi bei panacchini, quel cappello leggero galante, quella chioma, quell'aria brillante, quel vermiglio d'onesco color, quel vermiglio d'onesco color. Non più avrai quei pennacchini, quel cappello, quella chioma, quell'aria brillante. Non chiudrai farfalloni amoroso, notte e giorno d'intorno girando, delle belle turbando al riposo, Narcisetto a dolcino d'amor. Delle belle turbando al riposo, Narcisetto a dolcino d'amor. Fra guerrieri può far bacco, grande stacchi stretto sacco, schioppo in spalla, sciabla a fianco, collo dritto, muso franco, un gran casco, un gran turbante, molto onor, poco cantante, poco cantante, poco cantante. Ed invece del fandango una marcia per il fango, per montagne, per valloni, con le nevi versolioni al concerto di tromboni, di bombardie di cannoni che le porre tutti i tuoni all'orecchio fan fischiar. Non più avrai quei pennacchini, non più avrai quel cappello, non più avrai quella chioma, non più avrai quell'aria brillante, non più avrai farfalloni amoroso, notte e giorno d'intorno girato, delle belle turbando a riposo, Narcisetto ad un giro d'amor, delle belle turbando a riposo, Narcisetto ad un giro d'amor. Cherubino alla vittoria, alla gloria militar, cherubino alla vittoria, alla gloria militar, alla gloria militar, alla gloria militar.
Excuse me, guys. We're ready to start the second talk. Well, we've had some major issues tonight. Unfortunately, Cameron was stuck in Sydney with storms around Sydney tonight. We tried to get him up, but unfortunately we couldn't. And Aidan, our AV whiz, has done some wiring and things to connect Cameron up via a phone connection. So thank you very much for that, Aidan. I'll introduce Cameron. Cameron's a gastroenterologist at Royal North Shore Hospital. He's really a national champion for colonoscopy training and quality, and was involved in developing the surveillance guidelines and the item numbers, I think. So I thought he would be the best person to talk about them. He's going to talk mostly about the surveillance guidelines tonight. So without further ado, I'll introduce Cameron and hope it works via the phone connection. Cameron, are you there?
Yeah, Sam, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes. Lovely. I'll leave it with you now. Thanks, Cameron.
Okay, thank you very much. Look, thank you for the invitation to talk tonight. I apologise for the Sydney weather. I really tried everything, and Jane bent over backwards. I had tickets on about 4 planes, all of which got grounded. So I heard some of Ben's talk, and I'm hoping that the part of it that I did hear was sufficient background on that side of things. But as he mentioned, there are multiple things happening in the area of colonoscopy, independent of one another. So the clinical care guidelines were separate from the MBS item number review, and that was all separate from these surveillance colonoscopy guidelines that I'll try to cover reasonably briefly tonight. Those processes, as I said, were all independent of one another, and several people involved in all of them are in the room tonight, according to the delegate list I got sent. So, Jane, could you advance the slide for me, please? Jane, could you advance the slide for me, please?
Stream itself has about a 5-second, 10-second delay.
Yeah, no, that's good. So the first point that I would like to make is that these are just guidelines. They're not hard and fast rules governing to the day accurate time intervals between colonoscopy. There are supporting chapters. There's an excellent one for any registrars or trainees in the audience, written by Gregor Brown and a cast of thousands, dealing with what is regarded as high-quality colonoscopy in 2019. I'd recommend that to you. All of these are available. If you search surveillance colonoscopy Australia, all of these will come up. They're not password protected. It's on the Cancer Council site. So these guidelines were really an extension of the larger group of colorectal cancer guidelines that were updated in 2017. Very briefly, the Cancer Council ran this with federal funding, and to hope to gain NHMRC endorsement subsequently, they have to be in a certain format called a PICO question. Each PICO question costs a certain number of thousands of dollars to research. The overall colorectal cancer guidelines ran out of questions and funding, so these were a couple of years delayed, and a revision of the 2011 guidelines. So the three main chapters were IBD, post-colorectal cancer resection, and polyp. I'll cover the IBD guidelines, but my understanding was also that there were IBD gurus in the audience there tonight, so I'm not going to go into these in too much detail. So if you could advance the slide, Jane, please. They don't differ terribly from the 2011 guidelines to my reading, and those with IBD who deserve surveillance, Jane, if you could advance the guideline, advance to IBD, when to start surveillance. Okay, so those who deserve guidelines are ulcerative colitis whose disease extends beyond the sigmoid, or patients with Crohn's disease involving the colon and more than a third of the colon. Generally, surveillance should commence no later than 8 years after the onset of symptoms. If sclerosing cholangitis is detected before this time, surveillance should commence at that time of diagnosis. And patients with a strong family history of premature colorectal cancer before the age of 50 should potentially start surveillance earlier. So move on a slide, please. The next question is, at what interval should surveillance occur? And this depends on the presence or absence of risk factors, such as, if we could move on a slide, please.
Cameron, there's just a 5 to 10 second delay with the webcast from what you're seeing.
That's fine. So annual colonoscopy is recommended after commencement of screenings in those with active disease, and by that is meant patients where every time you look, they're never in remission. The disease is never quiescent. They're always mildly to moderately active. The presence of primary sclerosing cholangitis I've already mentioned. The family history I've already mentioned. Patients who have strictures, patients with multiple inflammatory polyps, presumably because this indicates severe disease at some stage in the past or a shortened colon, and those who've had dysplasia previously on biopsy. If there are none of those risk factors, a 3-year interval is reasonable. And if there are no risk factors and quiescent disease without dysplasia, obviously, is detected on consecutive colonoscopies, the interval can extend to 5 years. So next slide, please. I'm not going into this, but in general, the IBD chapter group recommended that NBI and preferably dichromoendoscopy be done with targeted biopsies rather than 4-quadrant biopsies every 10 centimetres. There is some literature, I understand, emerging initially from Canada about high-definition, white light, modern, careful colonoscopy being a reasonable alternative, but I'm not going to go into that tonight, nor am I going to spend too much time, if you could advance the slide, Jane, on colonoscopy after curative resection for bowel cancer. So the recommendation here is that complete examination of the colon should be performed before surgery, or in the case of the diagnostic colonoscopy encountering a stricturing cancer that couldn't be traversed, within 6 months of surgery, if the unexamined proximal colon wasn't resected with the cancer. So if somebody has a full colonoscopy, they should have their initial colonoscopy 1 year after surgery, and then 3 to 5 yearly thereafter, according to polyp findings and guidelines. So there are still places where I think people who have cancer end up having a scope every 1 to 2 years for the rest of their lives, and that's not what is recommended. So if you could move a slide on, Jane, please. What I'm going to spend most of the time talking about is resection of polyps, either conventional adenomas or clinically significant serrated polyps, largely SSLs. And the guidelines are a little behind the WHO update, which recommends that these things are no longer SSAs or SSPs, they're SSLs. So I must say that I didn't envy the chapter group, and there's at least one member of the chapter group in the audience tonight, I know. So if you could move on another slide, please. The challenges facing that chapter group were that the literature they relied on to provide some sort of evidence base was old studies done with old generation scopes and old colonoscopist behaviours, that is, old behaviours of colonoscopists, not the behaviours of old colonoscopists. And so you can see that in addition to that, when some significant follow-up period is necessary so that metachronous neoplasia, that is polyps and cancer, can be reported as an outcome or a consequence of the surveillance interval that took place, you can see that these are old studies, often from the 2000s, and translating those results into modern high-quality endoscopy units, while also taking into account the fact that colonoscopy is not perfect, either in detecting or completely removing all neoplastic polyps. Really, this chapter group had an unenviable task. Moreover, those studies that they were looking at to try to guide their recommendations were essentially unplanned cohort studies. So it wasn't as if there's a single study where 1,000 patients with a certain type of finding were allocated to specified surveillance intervals. The findings of the studies were really just in the group that got done at 3 years, this is what was found. In the group that got done at 5 years, this is what was found, etc., etc. So really a very difficult task facing this chapter group. But I just want to step aside from that process for a moment, and if we could advance one slide. Theoretically, what we should be aiming for is that once the colon is cleared, the next scope should take place not too late. We don't want a polyp that starts growing the day after the previous scope becoming a cancer before the next surveillance interval ticks over. But we also don't want to be too early. Like all of you, I really think there's little point in coming back and just removing low-risk diminutive adenomas. So too early surveillance is undesirable, not only individually, but also from a systemic point of view in terms of managing and triaging waiting lists. So ideally, we'd have a Goldilocks interval where endoscopically manageable adenomas, even advanced adenomas, were present in a significant enough proportion to warrant scoping. But that's just sort of my musing about things. So if we could advance a slide. Guidelines also have to take into account, secondly, the possibility of having missed something, which is to some extent dependent on colonoscopist quality, but primarily on the probable rate of evolution of new neoplasia based on what an individual patient has had at their previous scope or scopes. That is introducing the concept of polyp-type biology and how quickly the type of polyp that you would predict based on what a patient's had before will recur if a new one starts the day after your colonoscopy. So to go to the guidelines, as I say, they're all sort of theoretical musings that I'll come back to. So if we could go on a slide, please. The polyp surveillance recommendations use some definitions that I want to touch on briefly. So pretty similar to the 2011 guidelines, they talk about low-risk adenomas and high-risk adenomas. The low-risk ones are 1 or 2 small, that is diminutive or small, so up to 9 millimetre tubular adenomas that have Of course, they have dysplasia by definition, but they don't have high-grade dysplasia or velocity. So that's the definition of low-risk conventional adenomas, if you will, and high risk is essentially anything else, more than 10 millimetres or more, and with adverse histologic features like high-grade or velocity. So if we could move on a slide. This is a scary table. So this is the first of 3 or 4 grid-like tables in the guidelines and summarised in polyp.guide if you just want a quick, easy reference and you haven't got it on your phones or your endoscopy unit walls yet. So I find this quite daunting. I'm sure you've all seen it, but for those of you, the minority of you who haven't seen it, the number of conventional adenomas is listed down the left-hand side, 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 9, and 10 or more. And across the top, the first division is into size, less than 10 millimetres or 10 millimetres or more. And each of those size categories is further differentiated into whether or not there are high-grade or villus changes in the polyps. So size, velocity, and the presence of high-grade dysplasia are all interconnected, but to some degree separate adverse features of an adenoma. And the more of those you have, the worse it is, essentially, in terms of metachronous risk, and the earlier the surveillance interval should be. So, again, however, I find this a scary table to look at. And so I'm just going to break it down into more digestible chunks. So low-risk findings, if you could move on 2 slides, please, is really just this. These 2 squares or 2 elements in the table. And it's worth pointing out as one of the sort of the headline changes that in fact both of these represent a relaxation from the 2011 guidelines. So we're talking about conventional adenomas that are less than 10 millimetres and don't have any adverse histology. So if there are only 1 or 2 of those, the interval recommended is no sooner than 5 and consider leaving at 10 years. If there are 3 or 4 of them, which used to score you a 3-year surveillance, that interval has been, if you like, relaxed to 5 years. And really this covers quite a lot of findings, perhaps a healthy minority of findings. And as I say, both of those are relaxed intervals compared to 2011. Now, a lot of people have sort of approached me in the street, so to speak, and said, well, this is outrageous, we're sort of sentencing people who have 1 or 2 adenomas to come back in 10 years. And in the old guidelines, somebody of a certain age might have had 3 more scopes in their lifetime before they hit 75. And now they'll only get 1 if they're lucky. And my response to that is, well, probably the 3 was excessive and the 1 is probably closer to the mark. And indeed, it's worth pointing out for those who remain sceptical about leaving patients 10 years after 1 or 2 diminutive adenomas, that in multiple studies from multiple countries, it's repeatedly been demonstrated that those who have 1 or 2 diminutive or small adenomas at baseline, in fact, seem to have less metachronous risk than those who have no adenomas at baseline. It's counterintuitive, but it's a repeat finding. And in fact, some of the management committee said, well, if that's the case, they should just go back to fecal occult blood testing. Now, there's just, since the guidelines were researched and published, Joe Anderson and colleagues from the New Hampshire group have just raised a question about whether diminutive and small conventional adenomas indeed do have the same risk, with the small ones, that is 6 to 9 millimetres, perhaps being a little more significant. So if we could move on a slide or two, please. We'll go on to high-risk findings without multiplicity. So if we could click forward to that and to the following table. That's this part of that original scary table, the top half of it, if you like. So we've covered the two left-hand boxes, but now we expand that to small polyps, that is less than 10 millimetres, and move on to the table, the next slide, thank you. So they're still small, but they have some high-grade or villous change in them. And those patients are recommended to come back in 5 and 3. And the right-hand half of the table, if one of the adenomas at least is bigger than or equal to 10 millimetres, without adverse histology, the interval recommendation is 3. And with adverse histology, it's down to 1 if there are 3 or 4 of those polyps. So I think this is all reasonably manageable. I remain, and I have to be a little bit diplomatic here, I remain a little bit sceptical given the limitations of the evidence base and what the chapter group was faced with interpreting. I wonder in my heart of hearts whether each of those separate cells in that table can really and truly be justified. In any case, that's what the table suggests, and these are the guidelines that have been endorsed by NHMRC. So if we could move on to summarise, size, velocity and presence of high-grade dysplasia are difficult risk factors to separately tease out. They tend to correlate with each other, but the presence of 2 or more of those confers greater significance to colonoscopic findings and greater risk of metachronous neoplasia. So if we could move on to the slide labelled multiplicity. This covers the previously blacked out part of the slide, and multiplicity suggests that there's a field defect, and in fact, if it happens on multiple colonoscopies, raises the possibility of a polyposis syndrome. And I think the thing here is that this introduces the element of an increased likelihood of having missed lesions. And of course, that's one of the things that dogs recommendations about polyp follow-up. So if we could move on to the next slide, we've covered the top half of this, and below below the equator of this table, if I could put it like that, almost everything is a 1-year follow-up. There's a disparity between this table and the item numbers, and I've pointed that out to, I've provided that feedback to them. Essentially, anything more than 5 or more adenomas should score you a 1-year interval, unless all of them are less than 10 millimetres and have no adverse histology. So what I try to remember from this is that if you've got 5 adenomas or more, you come back in a year unless you're exceptional. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Serrated polyp follow-up has really been expanded in this guideline compared to 2011. If you remember, in 2011 there wasn't felt to be enough evidence to differentiate surveillance recommendations of sessile serrated lesions from conventional adenomas. But now, as you're all aware, there are a couple of extra tables. There's terminology to all of this, so clinically significant serrated polyps are SSLs or TSAs, and hyperplastic polyps 10 or more millimetres in size, and advanced serrated polyps are TSAs, SSLs more than or equal to 10 millimetres, and SSLs with dysplasia. So if we can move on, I really want to touch on some of the limitations of this literature, and I know Barbara's in the audience and may well want to talk to this later on. But all of the SSL recommendations, and don't forget that there are 2 tables that I'm going to present to you is based on 3 studies. Now, these were acknowledged as being of low quality. The evidence is level 2 or level 3. They're all from the period of 2004 to 2011, and the real kicker for me, the real killer in terms of trusting this evidence, is that the SSL detection rate was lower than 5%. Now, I had a look at who was coming along tonight, and I know there are some trainees and fellows in the audience, and I was going to pick on one or other of them and ask them what an elite SSADR was. And the answer is around 18 to 20%. That's what Doug Rex does. That's what Dr. Cruz does in Brisbane. And in the recertification data that have been published at AGW last year, the SSADR for physicians at least was 13%. So I have real problems putting too much weight onto these studies. If you think about it, and let's just round it off and say that an ideal SSADR is 20%, these studies are missing 3/4 of the SSLs, and they are sorry, I've just lost my slides. Sorry, so they're, oh goodness. Sorry, I'm just working off my slides and my computer screen's just gone blank. So when these studies reported metachronous neoplasia, most of that was probably missed lesions, and as you're all aware, not only are SSLs easy to miss, they're much more likely to be incompletely resected than conventional adenomas. So there's a sort of a triple whammy effect going on here, and hence my reluctance to put too much weight on the 2 subsequent tables. So I'm going to show you those, but I'm not going to leave them up for very long because I'm not sure that I trust the evidence base for them. So this is the table that's available in the guidelines or on polyp.guide for clinically significant serrated polyps only. And this is the even more perilously balanced table co-linking conventional adenomas with clinically significant serrated polyps. So I'm not going to leave that up for very long. A lot of it, pretty much in terms of numbers of polyps, pretty much follows the conventional adenoma stuff. Casting, if you like, if you look at it big picture, it's probably casting more weight on these than on conventional adenomas. Now I'm just going to move on. So can we advance the slide? One more. And then to larger neoplastic polyp surveillance, please. So en-bloc resection of large sessile and laterally spreading lesions, the surveillance interval should probably be a year. If the lesion's been piecemeal resected, the first surveillance is recommended at 6 months and the next surveillance 12 to 18 months later, providing that the initial surveillance scope is clear. So I'll let you catch up for a second because I'm moving on to the next. Now, I've reproduced, so there are a couple of ways. I find all of those tables bewildering, I have to say. And what I'm going to put up firstly is Gregor Brown's approach. He had a look at these and tried to come up with something that was a little more digestible for the Alfred triage and endoscopy unit. So with his permission, I put this up. I'm not going to leave it up for very long. Jane's got the slides. Sam's got the slides if you wanted to have a look at it afterwards. It's not exhaustive, but what he's done is clump a variety of findings into the recommended surveillance interval of 10, 5, 3, 1 or 1 year. I've had a careful look at this and a careful look at the guidelines, and it's by no means comprehensive. So, being anally retentive, I've done my version of this, and so if you could move on through Gregor's, move on. So my attempt looks like this, and I couldn't get it into fewer than 3 slides. So it basically just clusters things according to the recommendation for surveillance interval in the guidelines. Again, I'm not going to leave it up very long because I just want to make a couple of closing comments. So if you could move on through those slides, and you might leave them up later on or ask Sam for them if you want. Just to make a couple of closing comments. The issue of polyps, surveillance after polyp finding and family history has come up. Essentially, that can be boiled down into the statement that a positive family history doesn't impact on polyp surveillance guidelines. So if you have polyps found, they don't need any further intensification of surveillance if they also have a family history. And in people who are getting scoped, who might have 1 or 2 diminutive adenomas found, which would, all things being equal, result in a 10-year interval. If they have a family history, even if their scope is negative, Mark Jenkins' 2017 chapter strongly recommended sticking to 5 years. So in somebody with low-risk findings, it might be a reason to bring them back. A family history might be a reason to bring them back in 5 years. Final musing about, so if we could move on to future surveillance guidelines, I think probably, although it would be difficult, future surveillance guidelines should be operator stratified. You're clearly at higher risk of metachronous lesions if your operator has a higher miss rate. So perhaps future surveillance guidelines will take into account ADR and SSADR, because those things don't always correlate, and they also don't correlate with polypectomy ability. And the thing that I'd throw out there is that they should probably take into account polyp biology. I mean, if we're spending all this time doing high-quality colonoscopies and clearing colons, what we should be asking ourselves is, if an individual patient runs true to type and then in the future is going to develop conventional adenomas or SSLs or both, how long is it going to take that next lesion to become something significant? And one of my concerns about the SSL follow-up interval recommendations is that Barbara and the Envoy people in Brisbane have really clearly demonstrated that SSLs often have an enormous lag time, 15 to 20 years, and their development into dysplasia and BRAF mutant cancers really is pretty much age dependent. So we're all finding SSLs in young people, so we're going to be bringing them back every 1 to 3 years. I'm not talking about serrated polyposis, but that concerns me, and if we get a chance to talk, I can come back to that. So I'll just finish by saying that guidelines are guidelines, and these things are meant to give you some basis for thought. They were not intended to be related to the item numbers, although the discussions about item numbers recognised that there was no point talking about intervals without some reference to the evidence base. So, look, I'll stop there. I'm sorry I've rabbited on so long, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I like coming home to Brisbane, it's where I grew up. If it works, Sam, I'm happy to take questions. I'll stay on the line, but it's in your hands.
Okay. You good? Thanks, Cameron. Thank you very much for your insights. It's fantastic. And I'll put it to the floor now. I think Professor Leggett has a question/comment, so I'll give her the microphone.
I might make a comment whilst Cameron's hopefully still in the loop. Are you still there, Cameron?
Yes, I am, Barbara.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that. I entirely agree with everything you said. And actually, the comments you made about the studies that the SSL guidelines are based on could almost equally be applied to the conventional adenomas. Some of the studies that the conventional adenoma guidelines are based on are quite old studies with an ADR, nothing like what would you get these days. So it's not, the limitations are not limited to the SSL guidelines. I actually share exactly your concerns that we're finding a lot of SSLs in young people, and do they really need to be brought back so frequently? And in fact, my original draft had longer intervals, but that was changed. And I can see why, because it is largely an evidence-free zone. And I think the only way, but we had to write something. The 2011 guidelines said nothing about serrated polyps. And clearly we had to write something. Really, I think the only way forward to improve the situation is to get good data with modern colonoscopy. And it's really a challenge to the whole Australian gastroenterology community. We should be able to do that. And then we would know what the guidelines should be.
Barbara, I am still on the line. Thank you for that comment. I'm really sorry that I couldn't sit down and have a talk to you tonight about this, but I agree. I just wanted to highlight the SSL problem, but I agree. And for those who are throwing up their hands in the air and saying, "Oh, we shouldn't be lengthening surveillance intervals," I actually think the recommendations that have been made in this set of guidelines, 2019. Are probably overly cautious. If we're practicing high quality 2019 colonoscopy, I think we're probably clearing more colons than any of the studies on which these guidelines are based. And I suspect that if we stick to these guidelines, we're shorter than the Goldilocks interval and still very safe.
Any other questions?
Hi, Cameron. This is Jake Begun in Brisbane. I really enjoyed your talk, and it's clarifying. I wonder if we're lengthening intervals, do we have the opportunity to start bringing the age at which we start screening for colorectal cancer earlier? We seem to seeing multiple papers coming out now with earlier ages, popping up age 45, for example, from America now, where we see an increased incidence. Is there any thoughts about when we should be starting to screen people?
Oh, look, it's a very good question. Thank you for that. A couple of comments. In the States, I think there are 4 separate august bodies that make screening recommendations, and only one of the 4 of them has recommended bringing screening forward to 45 from 50. The other 3 have considered it and rejected it at this stage. For information, I sort of looked at this, and I'm aware. Look, I think Australia is well aware of the issue of early onset colorectal cancer, and I don't think anybody understands why it's happening. It's certainly not simple, or it's definitely multifactorial. It's not simple genetics, and I don't think even the environmental contributors are simple. But the thought that crossed my mind was in 2006, when the feds decided that they were going to start a program, they looked at the incidence of colorectal cancer in 5 to 10 year age groups and decided that the 50 pluses, that was when the incidence was high enough to start screening. So what I asked via the program advisory group of the AIHW was to tell me in 2006 and 2018 was when I asked them the question, what were the incidences in the 40 to 50s and the 50 to 60s? So the extension or the rationale being, if the incidence in the 40 to 50s had come up close to what it had been in 2006, in the 50 to 60s, then sure, maybe we should seriously consider it. It has gone up from 2006 to 2018, and in the 50 to 60s, the incidence has gone down. But the current incidence in the 40 to 50s is nowhere near the 2006 50 to 60 incidence. It would be easier to explain that with with some doodling on a board, but I think you get what I mean. So in other words, we have, if we accept that the 2006 threshold for starting screening in 50 pluses is a reasonable threshold, then the 40 to 50s, even though they've gone up since then, are still nowhere close to it.
Thank you, Robin Nagel, Toowoomba. Thank you, Cameron. It seems a paradox to me that we know we're finding more SSLs now. We know they've got a long lead time. Therefore, we can assume people are going to get a bowel cancer at a later age. And yet we've now stopped screening. We've reduced the amount of screening we're doing with people with older first-degree relatives. Can you explain that paradox to me?
Yeah, look, it's a very, very good question. And along the same lines, somebody asked me recently, well, we're cutting off polyps in 50 and 60-year-olds and preventing cancers, so people are going to lose their family history, and I guess that's probably true as well. In terms of continuing surveillance, these guidelines do talk about stopping rules in the 75 to 80-year-old age group, depending on the Charlson score. In other words, somebody with comorbidities, you probably don't look for the purpose of polyp surveillance beyond the age of 75. If somebody's as fit as a flea, you might extend that to 80. But the thing that concerns me about the current screening program is that SSLs, for SSLs, fecal occult blood testing is useless. It has no role. And of course, it's mainly designed to detect early cancer that starts to microscopically bleed, but it will pick up a substantial number of advanced conventional adenomas. Casting my mind back to a study from Tenerife where they compared FOBT and colonoscopy. I think at the end of the period of the study, all of the FOBT patients were offered colonoscopy. They all took it up. And something like 40% of the advanced adenomas had been picked up by FOBT. But, even an SSL that's just about to go dysplastic in somebody who's sort of 65 to 70, that's not going to start bleeding until it's actually cancerous. So I think a good case could be made, particularly in people who've ignored screening up until then, for everyone to get a one-off scope at about 65, 67, 70, something like that, just to pick up the SSLs, because the current screening program is not going to do anything to pick them up. And the BRAF mutant cancers are about 25 to 30, maybe even a little higher, percent of all colorectal cancer. So it's not an insignificant minority. So it's a very good question. I don't know the answer to it. Sorry.
Sorry, just while I'm on
Thank you very much, Dr. Bell. I'm Dr. Sam Islam. I'm just a simple local. There were a lot of talk about the size and indication for repeat colonoscopy, but we haven't even mentioned about the prep quality and how accurate was the measurement. Because I have seen even today a case where a patient had a polyp which has adenoma, but then the endoscopist mentioned that view were not optimal in the cecal area. And also these were not taken into consideration in terms of when to re-scope them or when to repeat them, and what are the other possibility of measurement problem, because you may think it is 10 millimeter, but in actual fact it could be 11. Is there any range that can be overlapping, like 5 to 8, 8 and more, or something like that? Because we don't know what happens to 9 millimeter polyps. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I'm sorry, the audio's not great, and I only picked up a bit of that. I think I'll respond to what I think you were asked. What of it I heard. Look, I think the size is the endoscopist's call. Number one. Number two, we know from David Hewitt, and I think Nick was involved in it as well, that we're terrible at estimating size unless we've got something to compare it to. But we are taking polyps off, so we can compare the size of them to either the snare sheath or the open snare to give us some sort of a guide, or I suppose you could compare it to an open biopsy forceps as well. But it's the endoscopist's call, and that's why high quality reporting is important, so that important number is there in writing. The pathologists can't tell us how big the polyp is because we should be taking off fried eggs. And so even without issues as shrinkage and curling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, if you take off something that is 10 millimetres wide, it's probably a 5 millimetre polyp with a 2 millimetre safe margin around the side. So it is the colonoscopist's call, and we should be trying to compare it, taking an extra 1 second before we open the snare and lop it off. We should be taking an extra 1 second to try to accurately determine, a more accurate size. And I don't really think, you've got to keep the polyp details reasonable. I don't think I think sticking to diminutive, small, and 10 millimetres or more is reasonable. I don't know whether that answers your question, but I couldn't hear some of it. I'm sorry.
We might take one more question, I think, and then we might wrap it up. I think we could talk all night, but we'll have one more.
It's Sharam Safa from Logan Hospital. Thanks for nice talk. I have a case scenario. 35-year-old obese lady from Brisbane, coming from iron deficiency anemia. We find 1 6 millimeter polyp in the right colon. So based on the recommendation, it's going to be 10 years colonoscopy follow-up. I'm wondering how many of audience here are happy to or confident to tell that patient you don't need colonoscopy in 10 years. And based what Ben said about negotiating talking to the patient after the procedure, how can I translate these things to patient in a proper way to say I'm confident you're not having colonoscopy in 10 years' time, which I'm not confident. So first of all, may I ask how many of audience confident to tell the patient not doing colonoscopy in 10 years' time? Anybody do 10 years? Who's going with 5 years? Any comment, Cameron? Because that's a real challenge and real case for us. And
no, it's a great question. The guidelines say 5 to 10. I think bringing her back any sooner than 5 would be a little over-enthusiastic and possibly wasteful of the resource. But they do say 5 to 10, and they give you that leeway. And there is a sub-paragraph or a point under one of the tables where you can use patient characteristics. In my musings, I talked about using colonoscopist characteristics to perhaps impact on future surveillance guidelines, and patient risk stratification is underway. So, for example, I think you said she was morbidly obese, and the fact that she had a small polyp at age 36 would also, I know it's found for other reasons, but she had a small polyp at age 36 and she's morbidly obese. So she's someone I would bring back in 5. I wouldn't stretch her to 10. but nor would it surprise me if I didn't find much in 5 years' time.
Okay, thanks very much, Cameron. I just want to thank our speakers again, Cameron Bell and Ben Devereaux, for some great talks tonight. I also wanted to thank our sponsors, Olympus and Fresenius Kabi, for their support, and our AV guy, Aidan, with his last-minute heroics. That was fantastic. So thanks very much, everyone. We look forward to, I think, our first meeting next year. We have Peter Cotton coming. I think it's on the 4th of February. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks.